Welcome to another episode of my interview series. Today I'm talking with Lawrence Lepard. He is investment manager at Equity Management Associates. He's a sound money advocate, Austrian school economist, CrossFit athlete, and he's one of my favorite follows on X/Twitter. Lawrence, thank you for coming on.
Hey, Peter, really nice to be with you. Nice to meet you finally. I've been a huge admirer on Twitter and or X, I should say, of all your stuff, and yet we never really met. So I'm very happy to join you and looking forward to this.
Yeah, likewise. I was really looking forward to this. You are one of my favorite follows, legitimately, and every day you've got stuff out there that's thought engaging. I crib some of my topics off of your tweets, so I should give you credit more.
I wish my tweets would do as well as your tweets. Getting retweeted by Elon's a big deal. That was pretty impressive.
I am so thrilled with Elon. I got to say, though, we have, 435 politicians in Washington who have all sworn to uphold the Constitution, and it took Elon Musk to safeguard our freedom of speech.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, so he has been epic. I sort of joke about it, but it's not actually a joke. Like, if we're living in a simulation, I think there's a very good chance Elon is the actual player. And like, all the stuff he does.
Yeah. No, I hope it's not a simulation. I don't think it is, but but yeah, I hear you.
All right, so today, media is ecstatic. The mainstream bootlegging media is very happy. They're celebrating a 0.1% drop in inflation. That brings it under 3% for the first time in, about 3.5 years. So the New York Times wrote, quote, "Easing inflation has Democrats tasting victory." So what do you make of it? Is inflation going down? Is this a good thing? What's next for inflation?
Yeah, well, look, all these numbers are cooked. I mean, and clearly inflation is probably down from the 9% peak that we hit, in June a year ago. But it's interesting. There was some tweets this morning that I put out. I mean, these people are all excited about inflation that's maybe running in the high 2s, low 3s. I mean, whatever happened to the Fed mandate of price stability, which would imply zero inflation? That kind of, I don't know how they've dumbed down inflation to be 2 or 3%, because that's pretty meaningful in my mind. And so I would react in two ways. I mean, one, I say bullshit, because I just, as an example, a piece of property I owned, the summer house I spent time in, the insurance on it just went up 100% year over year. So that's a big difference from 3%. And I'm not sure where that gets factored into the CPI. Probably doesn't. But, my auto insurance, same story, up 30% year on year. So, and I think most Americans are experiencing the exact same event, that these numbers are just kind of made up. And the reactions. I mean, it all is really kind of a simulation. I mean, the mainstream media is really kind of a simulation. I retweeted somebody who you had retweeted, I think, a guy who had the fellow from the movie, I'm the captain now, right? And Twitter and X say I am the captain now to the mainstream media, because without Twitter, without the internet, without all these alternative news sources, there wouldn't be any way for the rest of us to kind of communicate and understand that we're just being lied to 24/7, right?
Yeah.
So,
No.
I actually didn't pay much attention to this morning's release, because I was like, okay, here comes another lie. It doesn't really matter, right? So
Just one more.
Cool.
Well, and you're right. The larger point there, that was the original deal, that the Federal Reserve was going to protect the dollar, right? It was going to give.
Sure.
We were going to have this elastic dollar that was going to maintain its value.
Yeah.
And, before then, for the preceding 124 years of the Republic, we had zero aggregate inflation. And then they pimped this Fed as being the super protector of the dollar. And next thing you know, right?
Next thing you know, and it's been progressive, and we'll probably talk about it. I'm writing a book to talk about that, because it was, there were baby steps, right? I mean, and to be completely fair, there were some inflations prior to the inception of the Fed in 1913. When they set up greenbacks in the Civil War, there was pretty severe inflation. There was inflation after World War One. Fed was around then, but there was also inflation in of the War of 1812 and so forth. But they were small, and things went back to normal pretty quickly. I call it mean reverting, and mainly because we were on a gold standard or a bimetallic standard at some points in time. as you and I both know, the real big event was 1971, right? I mean, when Nixon broke the dollar link to gold, and I've got a chart on this in my book. I mean, it's just inflation took off like a rocket, and I mean, and since then, there's really been no turning back. I mean, it's there've been periods where it's reported lower, but in reality, I consider inflation to be a monetary event. Much like Milton Friedman said, and if you really look at the money supply, it's kind of consistently grown at 7 or 8% a year since 1971. So to me, that's the inflation that we've all really had to endure. The reported numbers, I think, are fiction that the government creates.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Right. We had periods of inflation and deflation. Generally, it was either war, it was natural disaster. We did have some boom busts.
Sure.
We had kind of quasi-Fed in the form of suspension of specie redemption, right?
That's where I was going to mention that. That was their get out of jail free card. They would release, they would stop specie, which is, where people could come with a bill and say, give me the actual gold. And I've got a great quote in my book where Murray Rothbard said, this was one of the biggest offenses against Americans ever when they started suspending specie redemption, and they did it multiple times. And look, this war of the people versus the banks, this has been going on since, the beginning of time, right? I mean, Meyer Rothschild said, let me control the money supply and I don't care who makes the laws. And, Jefferson fought over it with Hamilton, on the first central bank. And, Andrew Jackson, took him down on the second central bank. And, there were, because there was fractional reserve banking throughout the entire 19th century, we did have booms and busts. But I've also got a chart in my book which shows that those were much more controlled compared to what we've got now. I mean, this is just insanely out of control. The fact that we have, interest rates that were zero for, a large number of years. I mean, that was an economic crime. It's really the only way to describe it. I mean, and it hurt it hurts everybody. I mean, one, it creates continuing but think about it. I mean, one thing I pointed out in my book, I did some research on this, 2008, 2009, you're a retiree. You've got, say, $500,000 or $1 million saved up. It's your whole life savings. You're not working anymore. And, and because I know people who are like this, and you could buy, CDs and earn 5 or 6% a year. And, that would give you 50,000 of income. You have a little bit of Social Security. You live modestly. Your house is paid for. You're good. Well, 2008 comes along. We got to bail out the bankers. Bang. Those interest rates go to zero. That CD income just disappeared. It just disappeared. And, that's just a crime. It's just an absolute crime.
Yeah, and one of the effects there, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there are a lot of people who they didn't want to play the stock market, right? They worked their whole life, they save up money. In the old days, you could put it in bonds, you could put it in a CD, and you could live off that.
That's right.
And
they forced everyone to become a speculator.
Yeah.
In their game that they control. And it's criminal, Peter. It's just absolutely criminal.
And I think one thing that a lot of people miss, there was this, it was a Twitter account. He works with Peter McCormick, but he was running, it was called WTF 1970.
I love that account. Yeah. He's a good guy. I know him pretty well. He's a good guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he is a good guy. I keep pushing him. I'm like, do this as your gig, man. Like, people.
Yeah.
Here, for listeners who aren't familiar with it, can you describe kind of what he did and what it means?
He just went out and he gathered a number of charts. It was WTF 1971. In fact, I think if you Google that, you can find his Substack that has it. And there are probably 50 charts on that Substack that just kind of show how things have deteriorated since 1971, whether it be inflation or, productivity or wages of the average American or, healthcare. I mean, it just got into everything. I mean, it's, fiat money ruins everything, really. It creates fiat life. And, I mean, there's an endless number of examples that, that shifting your time preference the way fiat does makes things worse. And it's obvious, right? And now, I mean, the point, I think you and I probably, as Austrian economists, we've known this for some time, right? This is not news to us. I've known this for a bunch of years. I'm sure you have too. I think what's happening now, though, is very interesting. Is this is getting really severe, right? I mean, and everybody, if you don't see this, you're like blind. And so I think, we're coming to a head here, which I'm sure we'll discuss. But
yeah. All right, zooming out, because I do want to get into the book and I want to talk about the sort of causes and solutions. But before that, I do want to ask you, so what do you make of the real economy right now? Okay, so if the inflation numbers are garbage, what about the growth numbers? Like, are we in recession? Are we close to recession?
My view is we are in recession. I think they're cooking these numbers too. I mean, certainly on a real basis. I mean, you can see some nominal numbers going up, but if there's a lot more inflation than is reported, then the actual real GDP would be going down, which I believe it is. As you're aware, we just triggered the Somme rule, which is to say that the unemployment number just went up 50 basis points off its lower level. And I think you tweeted recently about some, the employment numbers not looking good. And I suspect they're worse than reported because, as you know, they're able to, they have a fudge factor in there where they can, they have a birth death model and, people that don't report. So my view is the economy's in pretty rough shape. Now, it also, though, it strikes me, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there's a little bit of a two-tier economy. I mean, the people who, are doing better than average or are hanging in there. I mean, they're all getting hurt, but they're hanging in there. I think the average American, the median person is just getting killed. I mean, I feel like I'm getting killed and my income's okay. So I can only imagine what somebody who's, working at a lower wage is facing in terms of the costs that they're encountering. And it's tragic. I mean, that's a big part of the reason for the book. I mean, I'm writing the book I want this book to be read by somebody who is maybe not familiar with the Federal Reserve, not familiar with the financial system, not familiar with a lot of the things you and I are discussing, but knows that something's deeply wrong and is trying to ask, and wants to understand why and what it is and then what they can do about it. And so that's the goal of the book, is to write something that people can dig into and say, oh, I get it now. I see what's been going on. And furthermore, I understand what I ought to be, advocating for, because, this whole blue-red, dynamic. And of course, we all have views on, the better parts of that. But, a lot of what's being argued about in politics, I mean, it's like these people at the top, they just want to get us fighting with each other rather than, it really is the 99% against the 1%, right? We got to fix the monetary system to make it fair. And then a lot of these other problems will solve themselves.
Yeah, it's like that scene in The Matrix, right, where looking in the hallway, right, and then all of a sudden now he can see through it. And it's like, if you look at the banks, for example, so in the 2008 crisis, you had this moment where it looked like left and right were finally going to join together. We were, united in the goal here. So you had Occupy, you had Tea Party. Both of us were pissed off at the banks, crony capitalism. Yep. And poof, next thing you know, the banks are super gay. They just plunge both feet in on these social issues. They get, corporate America flips over to where it's very politicized. Outfits like Disney, right? Traditionally, these guys would stay away from politics with a 10-foot pole, wouldn't touch it, right? Right. And all of a sudden, right, it's like the dynamic shifted, and now it was divide and rule. Yeah, I mean, there's a part in the book about that. I mean, I remember the period very, very well. And, the people were pissed off about the bank bailouts, as they should have been, because they were incredibly unfair. It was socialism for the rich. And, and yet in that same year, the banks paid $20 billion of executive bonuses. I mean, they just gotten bailed out. They paid $20 billion. And then Obama came in, and there were people who voted for him. And I have to say, honestly, I did, regrettably. Because I actually thought he might try and reform things. And the first thing he did was he appointed, Larry Summers to be involved in the economic side of his whole program. And I immediately knew the fix was in, and Tim Geithner as well. I mean, and so, these were Wall Streeters, and, there was no reform, zero. Everyone walked away scot-free. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained. An IRA is a retirement account that can save you a lot of taxes if used correctly. With Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, and it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Go to unchained.com, save $1,745 on an IRA using promo code AUGUST. IRA, that's AUGUSTIRA. Now back to our show. That to me was the beginning of this fourth turning, right? Where, 2008 was just an enormous crime. 1971 was a crime, but, we carried on for quite some time, and the damage took a long time to manifest itself. But '08,
Boy, that was even bigger, much bigger. And I still don't think we've really healed from that. I think we've probably been in a recession since that time. You know, you've probably seen the charts of industrial output and so forth. They've kind of been flat since '08.
Yeah.
Electricity consumption, et cetera, the things that would generally indicate a healthy and growing economy.
Yeah, well, that's what seems to be happening with every recession now, is that every time we get hit by the recession, we kill some more of the golden goose. You know, so after the 2001 recession, if you look at productivity numbers, those collapse. So, you know, you've got like this decent trend going through the 90s, and all of a sudden you lose about half of it. 2008 again. If anything, in 2008, it probably got worse. I mean, if you look at what happened last year with the banks, they didn't have to go and threaten or bribe any bailouts this time because it was all automatic.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I read Nick Timiraris' book. I mean, it was a very convenient excuse. And, you know, I don't want to go down the COVID rabbit hole because there's a ton of stuff there, but it's not worth going there. But yeah, it gave them great cover with which to print a ton of money. And it does beg the question in my mind of what's the next cover. And of course, probably it's war, as we can see what they're trying to put on us right now. But there could be something else. I mean, it could be just the market's breaking. I mean, the playbook of the other side is create a crisis and then, you know, react to the crisis and say, well, we had to do it because if we didn't do it, the ATMs wouldn't work, you know, and it's for your own good. Oh, and by the way, we're sorry that the price of gas went up 50%. You know?
Well, nobody could have seen it coming.
Exactly. Nobody could have seen it coming. Right. It's all just a big broken system. But you know, the book is actually quite optimistic. I mean, let's not to just sit and complain and shit on it. It's really terrible and broken how wrong it is. But, you know, I look at the world and I say, okay, that's the bad news. The good news is we've got the internet and we've got, you know, Elon and we've got, you know, podcasts and we've got, you know, the mainstream media dying and we've got everybody lying and you know, but those of us who are still awake and critical thinking are very much aware of the problems. And, you know, this is unstoppable. I mean, this internet thing is just we're going to tear down this big centralized structure that's sclerotic, broken, and corrupt. And so the internet is the information side of it, and then Bitcoin is the economic side of it. You know, that basically we've now finally got a form of money that can't be corrupted or printed to excess. And so I think the combination of the two has got me just incredibly hopeful and optimistic. You know, you know, but to be totally fair, and as I'm sure you're aware and the listeners are aware, you know, this is going to be a bumpy transition, right? It's going to be a very bumpy transition.
Yeah, no, I agree with, you know, sometimes people ask me, like, most of my videos are talking about horrible things, you know, like son of and wars, and people are like, why are you so cheerful? It's like, because I know we're going to win.
Exactly.
That's
exactly right. You know, it's just, yeah, I mean, look, this is a more powerful idea. Humans aren't stupid. And you can just see the trends and extrapolate them out. And I mean, look, Jay Powell is holding a losing hand. I mean, if, you know, he is screwed. He is holding an absolute losing hand. And I'm sure he's just sitting there thinking to himself, good God, please get me to May of 2026 so I can get the hell out of here. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, part of me feels, all right, so the water is boiling.
Right.
And boiling very gradually, depending when we start the clock. You know, you could argue it's the Pendleton Act.
Right. Yeah, right. Go way back, yeah.
Yeah, that created the deep state. You could argue is World War I that created this sort of imperial government. But at any rate, the water has been boiling, and generation after generation, people are getting brainwashed. So part of me, every time that the water goes up a little bit, you know, every time inflation peaks up, every time we get some sort of disaster in Ukraine or something, I'm sort of, you know, part of me is hopeful that the frog, I mean, a lot of the frogs already see what's happening.
Right.
You know, 10 years ago, if you said that government numbers were lying about inflation, or if you said that there was a, you know, sort of fake consensus where, you know, media is inventing things, you would have been a crazy person.
Yeah.
And now, you know, pretty much half the country believes that. Billions of people all over the world believe that. So, you know, things are getting better. And so in that context where so many people have their eyes open, you kind of want the water to boil just enough that the frog actually finally realizes what's happening, right?
I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a great observation. I mean, it's, it's unpleasant going through all this negative stuff they're doing to us, but in turn, that's what it's taking. I mean, 30 years ago, I knew the deep state killed Kennedy. And, and I remember my father was a U.S. veteran thinking, you're nuts, and being angry at me, saying, our country would never do that. And, but I get it. I mean, he was an American, and he was a vet, and he believed. And now I think I'm hard pressed to encounter almost anybody, that I know that doesn't understand that that's the issue. I mean, here you've got got a presidential candidate, the cousin of, or the nephew of the guy who was killed, saying it, just outright saying it. And so yeah, the Overton window on a lot of things has really, really shifted in a very, very positive fashion for our side. And that's a good thing. And again, it goes back to these technologies. I mean, even 5 or 6 years ago, we weren't able to do these podcasts very easily, right? I mean, having enough, bandwidth and the technology to do all this. I mean, it's just, things are spreading very, very quickly. And that's, it's great. It's all good.
Yeah, Murray Rothbard, he had a line, I think he was writing in the 1970s, and he said that you could fit the entire libertarian movement into a single living room in New York.
He was probably right.
Yeah. And, the way back then, if you were trying to start like a libertarian movement, you would start a mimeographed magazine. You would try to get anarchist bookstores to carry it, perhaps without realizing what it is. You would put a little self-addressed stamped envelope thing in there, like send me $20 and I'll sign you. I mean, it was, it was built.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, apart from Henry Hazlitt and, Murray Rothbard and just a handful of other people, in the olden days. Yeah. I mean, and they were all gold bugs, and I've been a gold bug forever. So I know who they all were. And yeah, I mean, you had Lou Rockwell, and you had, the von Mises Institute and so on and so forth. And that this is one of the things I've always said that I just found so amazing, because I've been fighting this battle for a long, long time. Is that, as a gold bug, when Bitcoin came along and then Bitcoin really got some traction, and then Safe's book, which I think is really a world-changing book, got a lot of traction. It was just fabulous to me, because suddenly I had 20 and 30-year-olds quoting von Mises, and I'm like, holy shit, how did this happen? I mean, look, I've known this for a long time, and I've been saying it, but it was I was truly a man in the wilderness, just yelling at trees. Nobody was listening. Nobody cared. And I have to say, even writing this book, there are times I was sitting around thinking last night, I said, am I Don Quixote here? I mean, is this just a pointless exercise? And yet I'm beginning, I get enough positive feedback. I've got 180,000 followers on Twitter, and, the pods are making their way around. I have people approach me from time to time and say, hey, I saw your stuff, and I agree with you I think this is how it happens, right? I mean, and the interesting anecdote I've talked about in the book, I mean, you study the American Revolution, which was also a fourth turning, it wasn't like immediately everybody said, we got to get rid of the British. I mean, John Adams, right around the time of the Declaration of Independence, he said about a third of the people were, let's get rid of the British. A third of the people were loyalists. A third of the people were like, I don't give a shit. I'm just farming, and so it takes time, and then it ultimately became obvious that we got to get rid of the British. We got to be an independent country, and they set up an independent country. And I think there's an analog there to what we are now. We're not even at a third of the people yet that really understand that sound money is the issue. But I'll tell you, this inflation, this most recent, the 2008 was the kickoff event to the awakening, what I would call, surrounding this fourth turning. And then, the COVID, money printing in excesses was kind of was the first booster rocket. And, now we're in it, right? I mean, now it's really happening. I think things are going to happen quickly. And these fourth turnings are typically 20 or 30 years. So, what does it take us into the, mid to early 2030 timeframe, maybe? I think by that time we're going to have to resolve this monetary issue because of the math. It's inevitable.
For people who aren't familiar, what's the fourth turning?
Oh, yeah. So this is a book written by Howe and Strauss. It came out quite some time ago. It was very prophetic. I think it was written in the late 1990s. And they've developed a social model which basically says that every 80 years there are cycles to human activities, and that every 80 years, and these cycles are based on generations. Every 20 years is a generation, some time that somebody comes from being born to coming of mature age. So there are 4 in a saeculum, which is what they call it. So every 80 years what they call a big crisis. And the big crisis is something that needs to be resolved. And then after the crisis is resolved, everything is different on the other side. And so they've happened every 80 years. And let's just march backwards. Let's assume we're in one right now, which I believe we are. The one before this was 1929 to World War II. So that was a big crisis that, the issue that was resolved was that fascism was stamped out, we weren't going to let Hitler take over the world. The one before that in America, in America's case, was the Civil War, where, the federal government consolidated power over states' rights. And the one before that was the American Revolution, where, the new settlers on the continent said, hey, you know what, we don't need your royalty shit. We're on our own. So, in each of these things, there's a set of rules that exist before it, and then there's a new set of rules after it. And I think we're in one now. And I think the topic, it's interesting because I think Strauss died, but Howe is still alive. And Howe wrote another book talking about how this one's coming along. What was amazing to me, Peter, was that he didn't really go into any depth about the monetary system. And it's so clear to me that this one is all about the monetary system. It's, this is the issue. And in every prior one, there's been an enormous war, and perhaps there could be an enormous war here, but in history rhymes, it doesn't repeat. And I'm actually of the view that look, World War II was an enormous tragedy. 70 million people died. But I think that something good came out of World War II, and that is, I think humanity scared the shit out of itself in the sense that it became very clear that we could actually destroy the entire planet and everybody on it. And when that became clear, it's actually led to, proxy wars as opposed to all-out war, because everybody realizes what the implications of all-out war are. And I pray that continues to be the case. I think the only way that nuclear weapons would get used, in my opinion, is if a madman gets control of the button. And that's still a risk. But I don't think any calculating country could use nuclear weapons. I just don't think they could. So I think we can actually get through this fourth turning without a war, without an all-out war, without a nuclear war, just because everybody knows in the back of their mind what the implications of that are. But, this one is going to have one hell of a financial war, and they're going to be big winners and losers. And the losers are going to be the people who believe in fiat money, and the winners are going to be the people who have hedged their bets with sound money and hard assets. And I think that the difference for, the relatives of those two sets of people is going to be stunning, absolutely stunning.
A word from our sponsor. If you're looking for a podcast that cuts through the noise and delivers honest, truthful, and conservative perspectives, check out the Daily Signal podcast. Each weekday, they bring you interviews with policymakers on the issues that matter most. From breaking down complex legislation to exposing media bias, they're committed to giving you the facts you won't hear from the establishment media. Subscribe now to the Daily Signal podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Now back to the show. That's a great point that, if you look at the past two turnings, money has been front and center, right? So, Lincoln had the greenbacks.
Right.
Basically a hyperinflating currency. FDR broke the dollar in the first place, right? He took it off gold and sort of set up the problem that, sort of matured going into Nixon when Nixon finally finished it off. And that actually brings us to the book that we've been talking about. Okay, so the title that you sent me, which may be a working title, Why America is Broken and How Sound Money Can Fix It. So let's kick off with that. What broke America?
Fix the money, fix the world. Well, inflation broke America. We are broken because the monetary system is broken. And I've been saying the money's broken for a long time. And then Lynn came along and wrote a great book entitled it that. So I didn't steal it from her. She didn't steal it from me. We both came to the same conclusion. The monetary system is broken, and fiat money is destined to fail. I mean, Voltaire said this, 200 years ago. It always returns to its intrinsic value, which is zero. And we set in motion a process of inflation that is a perfect example of what I call Stein's law, which Herbert Stein was a Nixon economist. That if something cannot go on forever, it will end. And a lot of people criticize Keynes, and we, as you are aware, we all are aware, the world kind of runs on a Keynesian economic model, which is, use debt to stimulate demand, to create growth. And, if you need more growth, you just take on more debt. And the problem with that is, as my pinned tweet shows, is that if the debt grows faster than the underlying capability of paying the debt, eventually you reach a crisis point where, you're unable to service the debt. And I reference Ray Dalio's great work in my book, which just shows that these have happened for, hundreds of years over and over again. I mean, this is not something new or unusual. It's a little unusual in the sense that, we're dealing with the world's reserve currency, right? A lot of the other inflations, high inflation / hyperinflations have been in more third world countries, although, the Weimar one in the 20s was a very developed nation. But the point is that, the money is broken and we are getting to kind of the end of the can kicking road, in my opinion. And so, something will have to give. And, there are a lot of ways this could occur, which, I'm going to try and discuss in the book. But, in my opinion, the most civilized way to do it would be a monetary reset. I mean, a lot of people criticize what FDR did. I know my grandfather criticized him. I don't think it was right that he seized the gold, but actually restructuring, devaluing the dollar in gold terms in a deflationary event was the right thing to do. I mean, he had to do it. And when he did it, the market rallied in 34 right after when he did it. And it started the process of recovery. Now, Smoot-Hawley and a lot of other things made the Depression go a lot longer than it should have. But the point is that what we need to do, we've got too much debt, and we actually need to just, repudiate the debt or restructure the debt. And there's no way, I mean, the debt holders are not going to get paid in full. That's just, full stop. So people who own debt and people who have fiat currency are, they're basically sitting ducks for massive wealth loss. And they don't realize that, but they are. And so, we've got to do a restructuring. I mean, now, if we don't do it in a structured manner, via a gold reset or a Bitcoin reset, the way that Loomis or Luke Roman has spoken about, then fine. It's going to happen in an uncontrolled manner, which is to say we'll have hyperinflation. And, that's not typically a good thing because that's what led, the Germans to choose Hitler. So, want to avoid that.
Yeah, I mean, I think FDR could have gone the route that we chose in 1920. James Grant wrote about that in the Forgotten. Yep. Which is where he did absolutely nothing. It was actually President Wilson had a stroke. His wife didn't feel confident about making economic policy, which turns out to be, that would make her our best economic president in 100 years.
Right.
Who did nothing.
Yeah, right.
And, they didn't do anything, meaning that prices fell so hard that everything liquidated, meaning liquidated in this context, meaning that things fall to the price where even if people don't want them, they're so cheap they buy them anyway.
Correct.
And so the market's cleared again and the economy comes rushing right back. But failing that you don't have a president's wife who, couldn't be bothered to do anything about it, our greatest president of the century, then, yeah, I mean, it fixed the problem quickly. Of course, the cost of sort of a permanent.
Yeah, and the bigger problem there too is I mean, the 20 example is a good one as a comparison. The thing that makes it a slight apple to the 29 orange, it was just the magnitude of the bubble in the orange. I mean, when Ben Strong administered his Coute de Whiskey in 27, he had the Long Island Conference and said, well, it's not going, we need to help out Britain even more. Let's just print some more money and cut some more rates. And the market went up 120% in 16 months or something. I mean, holy shit. I mean, the 1929 bubble, I mean, everybody talks about how bad the Depression was, and it was bad. I talk about this in my book. It almost, destroyed my grandfather's business. Yes, it was really bad. But it was, and the answer to that is not what do you do policy-wise once you have something like that. The answer is to never let that kind of thing happen. And that kind of thing happened because the Fed blew an enormous credit bubble, and by the way, the parallels here, I mean, ZIRP, okay, ZIRP, for zero interest rate policy is what I'm referring to for those who aren't familiar. It was, from 2009 to 2015, having interest rates pegged at zero, and then again, doing it from the pivot in 2019 to, the end of COVID. I mean, good God, man. I mean, that was just, just nuts. It's just absolutely nuts. I mean, it's a tautology of, if money has a 0% yield, then intrinsically the money has no value, right? I mean, by definition. I mean, the capital asset pricing model, money is supposed to have a yield, right? So, I mean, that, and so for anyone to expect that the outcome of that kind of policy choice and behavior is not going to be really bad, is frankly, I think it's being naive, and it's terrible that these people have managed to get us into this position. And to me, it all comes down to, the guy that I consider to be the super spreader, which is, Ben Bernanke. That speech he wrote about inflation, making sure it doesn't happen here, in 2002, that's going to go down in history as one of the most irresponsible things a central banker ever did, ever. And Bernanke is going to be in the history books right next to John Law, who was the famous, criminal banker of France and in the HEN regime, took over and, blew the Mississippi bubble. So, it's bad stuff, and there's no way around it. But here we are, and all we do is we live in their world. I didn't want to walk the road I walked. I would have preferred just to continue being a good technology investor, which is what I was before I, got converted and radicalized for sound money. But, they did what they did, and then I've responded the way I've responded. So, it's just, it's made me, it's very sad. It's made me quite angry about, where our country is today, because these people have taken us down the wrong path. I said it when I was on stage in Madeira. I said, it's like I'm a pilot. It's like we flew into a box canyon, and, anybody knows you fly a plane into a box canyon, you don't have enough room to turn around, you're screwed, and that's kind of what it feels like here. So.
Yeah, and that's a big difference between, I think, Keynesian and Austrian, right? Is that Keynesian, they sort of don't start the story until the day of the crash.
Right.
Okay, well, now that it's crashed, what do we do? And that's, you're already in the box canyon. And Austrian looks at the entire cycle. So why was there a crash in the first place? How do we get here? Typically, money.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing it's so obvious to those of us who are Austrian is that, the Keynesian model gives Keynesians power and gives governments power, right? And, Keynesianism is a dream for a statist, right? The government can solve your problem. Well, those of us who are independent, the people who founded this country, recognize that the government should be responsible to the people, not the other way around. And because the government, that's just not the case anymore, right? The government is not responsible to the people anymore. We are pawns in their game.
Every week I write a free article on the hot topics in economics with regular deep dives into history like the fall of Rome, the Weimar hyperinflation, FDR's Great Depression, and the 1970s Nixon shock. It's free, so check it out at www.profstonge.com, PROFSTONGE.com. Now back to our show. Okay, so what I do want to ask is, all right, concretely, how do we return to hard money? Like without a crisis?
Yeah, well, that's a tough condition without a crisis. If sadly, I think it might take a crisis to get there, but if we wanted to do an adult and a mature way to do it, we would elect a president, maybe, the only one I see even close to being capable of doing this would be RFK, but we would elect a president who would stand up, and somebody asked me this question in Madeira, and I answered it on stage. We would stand up and we would say, look, folks, we've built the wrong model. We're following Keynesian economics, and it's just wrong. We can't continue to do this. We need to return to sound money. So what we're going to do is we are going to do a monetary reset, and we're going to revalue we're going to create a new dollar, and we're going to revalue the dollar to a fixed amount of oil or gold or Bitcoin or something that cannot be printed. And on a go-forward basis, the government is going to live within its means, and we will have this new sound money standard. Now, the immediate problem with that, from the point of view of a lot of people who have a lot of money, a lot of power, is it would very vastly devalue all the old money. So those people who have a ton of money denominated in the old dollar would take enormous losses. But for, the guy who's a plumber who has, a house and not a lot of debt and, the ability to, provide useful services, he'd suddenly be working for sound money, and he could save in that money, and it would be, he'd be able to save for his retirement and retire, comfortably and blah, blah, blah. For the financial actors, this would be a nightmare. And that's why, and they control the system, and that's why they don't want to do that. That's why they won't do that, probably until we get driven right to the brink. But, those of us in the sound money community, I mean, Judy Shelton is one of them, and there are a ton of us out there talking about ways to actually restructure the system and to try and make it fair. And there are things you could talk about, with respect to that. I mean, there's some people who say, well, you've got to have inflation, and, maybe you do, but, I don't think you do. I take that back. It's tricky, Peter. I mean, the answer is it's tricky, and sadly there are going to be, any way you look at it, there are going to be winners and losers. But returning to a sound money standard, I mean, one of the, so let's say we have a hyperinflation, which a lot of people think is absolutely impossible, and I don't think it's highly likely, but I don't think it's impossible. I mean, let Kamala win, put in Stephanie Kelton as the Treasury Secretary, and we're gonna have hyperinflation, right? And the hyperinflations are horrible. I mean, everybody who has saved up wealth in the old currency loses it all, right? Farmers don't lose because they have land, and people who have the ability to, young people who can work, they don't lose, or they lose, but they can, they got the rest of their career. Retirees on fixed pensions, they get destroyed. But generally speaking, in hyperinflations, and I've studied this, things recover pretty quickly post hyperinflation when you go back to sound money. I mean, there's a lot of damage done, but a sound money system. I mean, look, everybody in the morning just wants to get up and go to work and put food on the table and, love their family and live their life. That's 99% of the population of the world. The 1% that are psychopaths, they want to start wars and kill other people and have power and, do evil shit. And, those are the kind of people we should put in jail. And the rest of us who just want to work. So, my view is that even if we have to go through the hyperinflation event, it'll be better on the other side, much better, very quickly, if we can avoid the war.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people, when they hear hyperinflation, they think of Weimar Germany, and they think of that being the only outcome in hyperinflation. But, Brazil and Argentina had hyperinflation for about, 10 or 15 years back in the 80s. They weren't eating each other. I mean, it kind of wasn't as bad as I think people imagine. Now, of course, the problem there is that they sort of never fixed it. Like, it's not like they translated that hyperinflation into a gold standard and sound money in Brazil. Right. They just sort of,
it's called inflation, correct. But they got it back under control. I mean, yeah, look, there are variations on inflation. I mean, if you were to, I mean, as Luke Groman points out, if, Israel did this once back in the 80s, I believe. If we were to have a very high rate of inflation for a bunch of years, and get the government debt down as a percentage of GDP, we could then, maybe have a sustainable system. But I mean, the other way we could do it would be, as you pointed out, kind of the 2021 example where, we have real austerity. I mean, when people come and look to invest with me or invest in my fund, I mean, one of the things I say, they say, how does this not work? If they're intelligent, they ask that question, and most of them are. And I say, well, this doesn't work. If suddenly the federal government gets responsible, okay, we're going to means test Social Security. We're going to shut down all these bases. We're going to cut the military budget in half. We're going to balance the budget. And because it's really the deficits that are creating the problem. We're not going to waste $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East going forward. To the degree that we print money for spending, we're going to spend it on infrastructure. I mean, this is the creditism argument that, that some people make. Okay, then that might be a better solution as well. I mean, part of the problem, I mean, if we had run up all this debt to build out our infrastructure, train our citizens, remain competitive in technology, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I could even maybe arguably somewhat believe in statism. I mean, I'm not sure we would have done it correctly. I still think the free market would do a better job. But the point is, what really got us going here in the wrong direction is the military industrial complex and the forever wars. I mean, if you kind of look at it, I mean, $8 trillion, just poured into a rat hole, and think of the people killed overseas and everything else. And it started even earlier than that. I mean, I was young. I was, my teens when it occurred. But I mean, how do we kill 3 million people in Vietnam? I mean, I remember Nixon carpet bombing North Vietnam. These people were rice farmers. I mean, 3 million people, 3 million dead Vietnamese. That's half of the Holocaust. And we just got to sweep it under the rug. It's like really what the hell? I mean, it's just screwed up, right? So, we've got to get the government out of the war business. I mean, it's just, it's disgusting, absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, I agree. I think the wars don't get enough credit for how much of the disaster they've caused. You've got the money, you've got the lies, you've got the security state, a lot of this free speech restriction on, security, surveillance, but you've also got the horse trading. Because what happens in Congress is rather than having a small government party and a big government party where they negotiate, the Republicans will roll over as long as there's some new ammo for Ukraine, and they'll give the big government guys anything they want. And I think that's been going on since the 50s.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm not sure who coined it. I think it might have been David Stockman, but this whole notion of the uniparty, I think, is really, that's the right way to look at it. I mean, these are just two different flavors of the same ice cream. I mean, they're all in it together. I mean, Eisenhower is probably the last honest president, right? And he warned us of this, right? And I mean, look, it's coming out of World War II. I mean, it's sad because this was a fabulous nation and not perfect. It's funny. I talk about the morality of this nation, how I want to get it back. And one of my Swiss friends said to me, yeah, oh, you mean the nation that, that committed genocide against the Indians? I was like, okay, you got a point. But I mean, in general, I think post-World War II, this is a pretty moral nation. We had a pretty nice standing in the world. We kind of, generally speaking, done the right thing. People wanted to be Americans. People respected Americans, And sadly, like so many things, we let that go to our heads. And, I blame a lot of that on the CIA and the national security state that grabbed control and started deciding they could go around the world and kill other leaders. And then ultimately they decided to kill our own leader and so on and so forth. I mean, these were very, very bad things that led us into a very dark place. And that's kind of where we are now. And so the task that we are all faced with is how the hell do we fix this? Because the founding documents of this country are fantastic. And to the degree that we can live up to the founding documents, this is a fabulous country. I'm not leaving. I'm going to fight to the end to try and make this place right. But, and so I believe in the ideal of America, but I don't think that, necessarily the execution has missed the mark versus the ideal, right? That's the problem.
Yeah. All right. So final question.
Sure.
One of the things that I've heard you talk about that I thought was really fascinating is fiscal dominance.
Yeah.
Can you just explain that to people and how it influences the Fed, also how it influences the government policies?
Yeah. So let's just define what it is. And I hadn't even heard of the term until a year or two ago when I think I heard, Lynn Alden and Luke Groman using it. But basically, it's a condition where when the government spends too much money and runs deficits, that the monetary policy becomes kind of ineffective. It almost doesn't matter what the monetary policy is because, the fiscal spending creates a need for money that ultimately the Fed will be forced into providing. And so, that's where I say, the math just does not work. And this is back to the Stein's Law point. Once the debt gets large enough, you've got to pay interest on the debt. And, if the GDP doesn't grow quickly enough to pay that interest, then there's only one other way to do it, and that's to print the money. And that's what we've seen. And although we are not arguably printing today because, QT is going on and they cut QT in half, I think they'll ultimately take it to zero. And then I think they'll change the bank regulations so the banks can buy all the debt, But ultimately, I think what's going to happen is we're going to be forced into a yield curve control situation because I don't see any willingness on the part of government to cut the spending. And I think the numbers just came out a day or two ago over for the July, deficit. And it's just every month is just records. I mean, if you look at the month-on-month growth on the debt, I mean, it really is kind of a parabola what's going on with cost of the debt, interest costs, size of the debt, government deficit. I mean, they are all just getting bigger and bigger in a reflexive cycle. And, where does that stop? I mean, the Fed balance sheet is $7 trillion. I think in the next event, when something breaks, when the next Silicon Valley Bank event comes, or the next Japanese unwinding, I mean, who knows how many swap lines we've given to them. I wish Bernie Sanders would file an FOA asking for what the Fed did in terms of swap lines to Japan, because I'm sure we gave them a lot of money to buy our bonds and to buy their own. That they're going to have to come back in with the printer going burr, bigger than ever. Each one of these events becomes bigger. I mean, it took Bernanke, 5 or 6 years to print $3 trillion. I mean, in COVID, what do we print? 5 trillion in, 2 years, less than 2 years.
Yeah.
So, so the next one's going to be bigger still, right? And each of these represents monetary debasement. And of course, the implication for that is that, gold will be at 5,000 and Bitcoin will be at 200,000. So, because they can't be printed. So, I mean, you can see that kind of stuff coming, but, we have to, it takes time, right? I mean, right now, I think now the goal, I'm sure, is just they're trying to hold it all together through the election so that they can get their person in office. And I'm sure they will, bend the rules, use the exchange stabilization fund. I mean, that's one thing that I don't think enough people focus on, the fact that they have an exchange stabilization fund, which is billions and billions of dollars. I don't have the number right off the top of my head, but it's a large fund, and they can use that to manipulate markets. I mean, as an example, when this market recently took a plunge as a result of what was going on in Japan, you just know they were in there buying with both hands to keep this thing together. I mean, they cannot have this market go down. They just can't,
Yeah, and they're actually wide open. They admit that they manipulate markets. There was the plunge protection team versus...
Yes, exactly, yeah. I remember that well when Greenspan set it up right after 87, yeah.
Yeah, so they openly admit that they manipulate markets. They openly admit that they lie. This is forward guidance. They try to sugarcoat everything.
Right.
It's based on this assumption that, if they say bad things about banks, then the bad thing might get worse. And so they're morally justified in lying. And of course, the end result is that normal people who don't have time to sit around and pay attention to this and, learn how central banking works, they get blindsided every single time.
Every time. Absolutely every time. And that's what's just so tragic and unfair about it all. And that's why we absolutely, I mean, people say, what can you do? And the book talks about this. We just got to spread the word. We got to get, this can't, it's like you say, the libertarians, you could put them all in one living room. Well, now we could probably put them all in one football stadium, and we got to have it so that it's the whole damn country. We've all got pitchforks and tar and feathers, and we're marching on, the Eccles building in Washington, D.C., right? I mean, that's where we got to go, right?
Amen. March to Eccles. Okay. And bonus question. All right. What are the odds that they fix the debt runaway train versus what are the odds that they keep going till it breaks?
Oh, boy, that's a good question. I don't know. Well, you're kind of talking about maybe the structured reset versus they run it till it breaks. I'd say it's about a 70% chance they run it till it breaks, that they just keep kicking the can and it's going to break. And where it'll break, Peter, just to describe how it's going to break, how will you know it's breaking? Gold will be going up really quickly. Bitcoin will be going up really quickly. The yield on the 10-year bond will be going up really quickly. And the Fed will have to put in emergency programs to purchase those bonds. And the entire U.S. Treasury bond market will say to the Fed, sold to you. And the Fed balance sheet will go from 7 trillion to 40 trillion in less than 6 months or a year. And that'll be the beginning of the end for the dollar as a currency. Everyone will then realize, holy shit, they can never stop. This thing is going to be completely worthless, and therefore I have got to get out of these dollars. And that'll be like Weimar, where people will be buying anything, even if they don't need it, they'll buy it because they know that it will have value versus the dollar that they hold in their hand isn't going to have any value. And that's a mass Gresham's law event, which we don't have time to go into Gresham's law, but it's all in the book. I mean, and the aim of the book, I'm about 130 pages in. I'm not quite finished with it. It's got to get cleaned up, but I'm really hoping to have it out by year end because I think the timing here is important. I want to warn as many people as I possibly can.
All right, so those are the numbers to watch. Gold price, Bitcoin price, the yield on the 10-year, which measures risk and future inflation, a couple other things. Those are the numbers to watch. I have been talking with Lawrence Lepard. Tell people, how can they follow your work and how can they get the book? How can they keep an eye on it?
Yeah, so the work, the best way to follow my work is follow me on Twitter. It's just add my name, at Lawrence Lepard on Twitter. I make a lot of noise. I scream at the central banks. I've been profane in some of my interviews. I'm going to try and stop that. My wife has been all over me to clean up my act. I also have a website, ema2.com. I have a quarterly newsletter. My partner and I write it. We talk about macro events. It's free. We won't ever spam you. Just sign up for that. And the book, it's not up anywhere. You can't pre-order it. It's just in my head, written down. But I'm committed to trying to have it published by the end of the year. I'll probably just self-publish it on Amazon. There'll be a Kindle version. There'll be an audio version. All the usual stuff. So, and it may not be, it's not going to be as scholarly or professional as a lot of the other books out there. I keep the standards, compared to some other books, it'll probably be more colloquial, but that's really what I want it to be. I want it to be just a simple explanation for anybody who even, knows nothing about economics, but they can read it and go, oh yeah, I get it. This is why this isn't working, and this is why I'm being screwed, and this is how I can protect myself and what I should do about it. That's kind of the goal of the book.
All right, amen. Okay, thank you for coming on, Lawrence, and I hope to do this again soon.
Oh, anytime, Peter. It was really nice to meet you. I really enjoyed talking. It was a great conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to petersaintons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.